Well, in speaking about the activities of the Historical Society, we must remember the times have greatly changed. Now that we use the radio so much in those days, and we had for the school children a contest at a certain grade. All of this, of course, is in our minutes and in our archives, and I haven't looked at them, but I can just say offhand that I think we did it 3 or 4 times. And we would give drums as the prize, as a children's book, and we would advertise and tell them that we were going to do it, and then we'd notify the schools, and they'd tell us which grade they wanted it, and so on. And then when we got the answers, we'd have the children come and say, we're going to do a quiz. And we would do a quiz about the county history and about the Constitution or something. We bring in a little national politics, but mostly about Moore County. That's what we wanted to inform them. And that one of the battles, one of the skirmishes took place here. And if they hadn't heard of the House in the Horseshoe, which most of them hadn't, well, then, of course, we had very strange little things going on at the Shaw House that it would be hard, I think, to do, perhaps. But anyway, they're worth mentioning. I'd gone up to Fredericksburg and had seen at the Fielding Lewis house. He was the brother-in-law of George Washington. His wife was Betty Washington. And that's a very beautiful house, Kenmore. And their programming was very intriguing to all of us. I went up with Mrs. Cannon. At the time we were working on antiquities here. And, we saw the people line up and be only allowed to go in, I think, about 8 at a time, to look into the different rooms as scenes were enacted from the daily life of that Lewis family at the time of the Revolution. And the first room you would go into, you would see a group of men. Perhaps they were smoking a long pipe, perhaps they were sipping a little brandy, but they would be sitting in a group talking about the progress of the war. And Mr. Lewis was known for having supplied many arms to the Continental troops. So, of course, that was very current with his life, and the scripts had been carefully researched. Then there was a little gate, so-called, at the door, so nobody could penetrate the room. You would stand outside and listen, put your head over the fellow in front of you, so they're never too crowded. Then they would move on to the next room, would be perhaps the dining room, and there they would be seated at the table. And a little colored boy would be there with a long fan, keeping the flies away as they ate. And Mrs. Washington, the mother of Mrs. Lewis, would be seated there, and she'd say, "Now, my son." And they'd say, "Well, if Uncle George says so-and-so," the children would speak up. Then you would see the father seated at the table in the costume of the period. It was very well done. Then you would go into a bedroom and you'd see George Washington stretched out on the coverlet with his long legs hanging over the end of the bed. He was very tall. And then they'd say, "Shh, don't wake him. He's very tired. He just got off his horse. He's come all the way from, well, we'll say Yorktown or something." And I used to then watch that scene. So I said, let's have some fun. Let's have the Shaw House do the same thing. And there was this brilliant woman I've spoken of, who was a school teacher here and very imaginative, and she got the idea at once, and she had the children help her write these little scenes. And I think I told you, didn't I, that we had one in the sitting room. We had the lamp lighted. We had the father seated at that so-called Bible table, because we were told when Edward McKeithen gave it to us that it had been in the McKeithen family over on Blues Mountain, which is now in Fort Bragg. And it was called the Bible table because no child was allowed to put anything on that table because the family Bible sat there. And we had them read, the father read to the family some certain passages. One boy would be seated by the fire, maybe breaking nuts. Another would be carving something, whittling. And another child would be trying to do some needlework. They were all doing something. One little girl was on her mother's lap. So Mrs. Shaw would say, "All right, children, now we're going to hear scripture." And the father would read. Then say, "Let's join in a hymn." And then they'd all join in this little hymn. So it was a very charming little scene. I remember going outside and looking in the window and watching it from outside. The families of these children would come, you see, to Shaw House. They'd line up and they'd see their children performing. And then they did a dance. A man I saw the other day said, "I know you, Mrs. Ives. I was one of the boys who danced in that play at the Shaw House when we put it on." We had a little square dancing in the middle room. because there were no tea tables, it was just empty, before we had the loom. And I think there was a third scene in the other bedroom. But the vivid one in my memory is the one in the family scene. Then, of course, we were so pleased with the response of the young people doing these essays and answering these questions, these questionnaires on the radio. We felt we really helped in a little way. Then, of course, the publishing came along. There was no county history. And there was a great deal known by there was a Judge Adams up in Carthage who had put out a pamphlet on the house in the horseshoe and the little battle with Fanning's men. But we decided, and we asked at Chapel Hill, who was a good man, a good historian, who wouldn't charge us too much. So he sent Blackwell Robinson down. And as society had a committee that would choose. Well, Mr. Robinson was interviewed, and he was very receptive, but he was going to ask us too much money. So I said, well, he said, I have to have a house for the summer. It'll take me all summer. And he said, I have my wife, my children. I said, I'll give you a Paint Hill farm to use if you'd like. So he lived here. And he wrote the history, but he had the great help, of course, of Rasty Wicker and Edwin McKeithen, because they knew it. They were our two county historians, and they could give him leads, who to talk to and where to go. And he's done a very fine book. It's been reprinted 3 times. It's now in paperback, and anybody can read it. It's the first 100 years of Moore County. Then we realized we had to do the second 100 years. So Manly Wade Wellman, who's just recently died, was a very good writer. And I think in the end, he did about 50 county histories, something of the kind. And he did other novels. And he had a cousin who was well known. Anyway, he came up from Pine Bluff, where he was living. And his wife was a singer. Very nice people. And she helped. But anyway, he did it. He wrote the book, the second 100 years. Told about the Walter Hines Page and the World War II period and all that. So we had them. Then after that, Rasty Wicker compiled. See, so many records were lost in the fire of the Carthage courthouse. They had to go to Fayetteville often to find out the exact truth of who owned what. And as Rasty Wicker was the surveyor for the Tufts in getting all their land, he knew every family and every date and whatnot. Well, Rasty Wicker had collected so many papers of historic importance that they've all been put into a volume that we published for him. And, it's been astonishing that we could do that in this little society that has no foundation, financial foundation, no foundation at all. But we did it. And I just can't remember how many people were contributing, but of course we sent out letters and people signed up for the book. Their names are in the first volume, certainly. But it came to fruit.
What was the name of the book?
Well, it's Moore County History of the First 100 Years.
No. History
of Moore County's Second 100 Years. 1840 to 1940, we'll say. And, actually, when you consider that we saved a historic house that the state should have taken on long before, this little group did it and furnished it. People were very generous about giving to that. We put on a play that was written, we did it because outdoor drama was just beginning. Paul Green had started the first outdoor drama at Manthill, and it became very fashionable up at Chapel Hill to go to the outdoor drama. And it became all over the United States. While Andy was governor of Illinois, we put one on at Old Salem, the town where Lincoln lived before he went to Springfield. And we got a writer from North Carolina, Kermit Hunter, who did Unto These Hills, a sound and boom now. And so this Kermit came out to Illinois and wrote it for us, for the state of Illinois. Now here, we wanted to do the same. So we were given the name of a man at Chapel Hill who was doing this, came down, studied the site. It was natural for an outdoor theater. In back of that house, it just falls away, so you have a natural amphitheater. And we put up the seats, we have the drama.
And wait, that they did
it was at House in the Horseshoe.
Oh, beautiful.
You see, if you remember the site, where we go in now was the back door.
Mhm.
And the front door was looking down that bluff towards the river.
Right.
And that's where we had our drama. And I came back from Illinois for it because we did it in August. And it was very exciting. But we did that 2 years. But we had no local support in the sense that the county commissioners gave us nothing. And yet people were coming from all areas. Now we had a wonderful president in Sherman Betts. Captain Betts is the descendant of 2 signers of the Declaration. He has a sense of history. And he was willing to take on the presidency. And he pushed this drama. And I stayed with the Betts when I came down that summer to see the drama. And because every summer I've gone home, you know. But anyway, Captain Betts held the presidency longer than anyone. And I think he did more than any other one president ever did. He was interested in all angles and all of the county. He did the county calendars for years, taking pictures of houses that will go any time.
Okay.
I wish I could remember exactly which year. I don't keep diaries, and I'm not accurate about dates, but I came back from Illinois, and it must have been about 10 years ago, in the autumn, and I picked up a pilot and saw there was going to be an auction at the Boyd at Weymouth. I just couldn't believe that. I put down the paper in a tantrum because the Boyds were very special to me, and their house was very beautifully furnished, and it was a home, a real home. There was real living from sport to literature. And there was a creative family. So my son had gone for riding lessons with a little nasty boy and so on. I don't know, it was a terrible shock to me. So I found out that the college, I guess it was all in the paper, because I wrote a letter to the pilot saying how greatly I disapproved of it, and why couldn't a group of either preservationists, historical people, writers, people who cared about this thing, get together and save the property. Well, that so started the idea that we could do something, because I think it was been floating around that, oh, well, nobody can afford to take that place. And she had left it, oddly enough, Catherine Boyd, in her declining, ill years, to the college, thinking that the college was going to be a training school for young people. And she cared very much for that, because she saw so many young people leaving the community, going to the cities for jobs. She thought there would be more jobs because there'd be more training. And Dr. Stone was very anxious to get the property because Mrs. Boyd was also interested in horticulture. She protected her woods. She would go herself, and she would pay men to stand in the woods to keep the holly from being broken from the trees to be sold at Christmas. She was really kind of fanatical on it. It was a great thing. And as they had a lot of land, they wanted to protect the pines. And you know, when Mr. Firestone was building his house, she didn't like the telephone people, the wire people. I forgot what was telephone, I think so. To put any of their wires or cut down any of her big trees on Young's Road. And she had them change the wires to the other side of the road so that her fine, early, longleaf pine wasn't damaged. Oh, she was very keen. So it was disturbing to think the property could be cut into small lots. And there was a meeting. She had left the house apparently to the board. I can't remember what it was called. It was not the college as a university of the state. It didn't belong to the state. It was what's called the Friends of the College or something. Because I don't remember at the moment what they called it. But there was to be a meeting over in a hall at the college, and it was an open meeting. So we decided, the Hodgkins and I decided we would go. The Hodgkins were an old family here and very aware of everything that went on civically. And I telephoned to Paul Green, and I told him, he was a great friend of Mr. Boyd's, that this house was in jeopardy, its future, and the property. And he said, well, that can't be. He said, there's not a writer in the United States who wouldn't lift his hand for Boyd's property. Of course it mustn't be sold. I'll come down to the meeting. So I invited him to come here for dinner before the meeting, and he brought his wife and he brought his secretary, Mrs. Wynne, and they came to the meeting. So there we were gathered in this hall, and a lot of people we didn't know. And on the stage was seated this board of the, whatever it was called. I'm stupid enough to be able to say it. And I can't seem to remember who was the presiding officer, but I think it was Dr. McMillan. Anyway, at one point he certainly was at the podium. And I met Causey was one of the officers, and different faces I knew. Well, we heard them say what they had to say, and then one by one we got up. Paul Green, of course, led the whole thing. And he said, you can't do this. If we took up contributions tonight, we can begin to form a society to save Weymouth. And we can give $1,000 each. We can start the thing at this minute. And there, very soon thereafter, during the proceedings, a man stood at the back, and it proved to be Admiral Gallatin, but we didn't know him. And he said, I have been in the Navy. I know that houses are saved as rest houses for officers or men, and perhaps we could do something of that kind. He said, it's a pity to see those woods go, and it's a pity to see the house go. Well, we formed a little meeting. As it was over, for those of us who cared, I said, let's have a meeting next Sunday. Well, we chose the place would be the Weymouth Woods. They have a house there where the caretaker shows films. Right. And Catherine had left that property and arranged all that well before her death. So we met there, and lo and behold, I had two guests, the Heman Clarks from Fayetteville, he's a lawyer. They were here just calling on me, and I said, I have to leave the house to go to this meeting. They said, I'll go too. So the two came with me. And as we stood there was nobody to take the chair. And they turned to me, and I said, oh my goodness, I can't do this. And Admiral Gallatin said, well, I'll help you. And he took the chair. And it was a very formal little meeting. He said, now we're going to gather here to organize to save that property. And we did. And then they said something about the legal angle, and Heman Clark said, I'm a lawyer, I'll be glad to help you. And he did. So that was the beginning, really. And then we had the embarrassment of saying, how are we going to raise $5 million? And we knew we could do it. We did it first by my telephone. We heard the woods they were going to make money by cutting down the heart pine, the old trees. So I called up Mrs. Siemens at Duke University, who was very active there, and I asked her if there was a forestry department, if they have an expert. She said, of course we do. And I said, well, we are told that these are old trees and they're rotten. And she said, we're going to tell you his name. And he came down and had lunch and vetted that forest that day after lunch. And he had one man with him, and when they came back, they said, this is a forest primeval. These trees in this forest have never been cut. It's full of these red cockaded woodpeckers. And this is probably the last stand of a long-leaf pine. And then, of course, Heman Clark said, well, the long-leaf pine has saved Carolina through history. It was sent out as naval stores to the British, and it's a very important tree to this state. So then we had the conservation people, nature conservation, the conservatives. We met with them, and they said, we'll help you about going about this. So in the end of the state, we went up to the governor, Hunt, and had a meeting with him, and, the state took that acreage of longleaf pine, and it's protected now forever. So that part was good, but it left us the 35 acres of the house and its immediate grounds. So then we knew we had to do something. So we just got together at the house and thought if there were going to be this Mr. Reagan, actually the man who mentioned it first was Josh Reynolds. Now that Joshua Reynolds had bought a place, and he and his wife were keen on horses, hunting, and horse showing, and so on. But he had a memory of King's Mountain. I believe, maybe not King's Mountain, but it was a mountain retreat in the summer where writers went, and people who wanted quiet for thought and conferences and humanistic studies. And he said, that was folded during the World War II. Why don't you do that Mr. Boyd's memory. Well, that was a great idea. And Mr. Reagan said, that's a fine idea, we'll do that. We'll have writers. Give them a week or two at a time, come in here with no problems. And we give them a kitchen. They can make their own meals. They can wander through the grounds, and they can write. So that's really the way it began. And then we had to fix the rooms up that were the old servants' rooms of the house. And two of the girls got in there. It was Jane Clark, Marilyn Hartzell, and Virginia Holzer were seen there one day washing windows and pulling off wallpaper. They began to work. And Jane Clark was the one who said to me, look, don't try to handle this committee and this house without a woman's group that can do it, will do hard work. So we got more and more women. We organized what you call real women's committee. Now it's out of hand. It's over 100 women, and everybody's pulling every direction, and nobody is really boss. But anyway, that was the way we began. And then, of course, from the very beginning, as we sat around that table, one of the wonderful people in the group was Cottrell, Captain Cottrell. That man was responsible for the Dew Line. He had been, he was just a great genius, and he died. It was very sad. He knew he had heart trouble, and he dropped dead in Washington. His wife is still living here, Kitty. But he was remarkable. And then one day, Admiral Gallatin said, I wish we could have outdoor music. I'll never forget that, because now that we're forming outdoor music, going to have it there. I always think we ought to name it the Gallatin Festival, because he was the very first one to put it in words. But we couldn't think of it. We had too much on our hands at the time. And then we got Tom Green to work on the grounds, and he did awfully good work, and different ones would go and pull weeds, grapevines, and Mr. Hunt came down Chapel Hill to look at it. And he said, you've got to unveil this beauty before you make any plans. Just work with what you have and see what it is. You don't know what's under these weeds. You don't know what's under these vines. So, well, we'd see the holes where the people had dug out things, taken them away. Because the place, of course, being an old property, had very large shrubbery, very handsome shrubbery. So little by little, there we are. And then, of course, we got a little grant. I asked Mary Siemens if she would give us something, and she said, I'll help you. I said, I'd like to do the drawing room, the big room. And it had always been a living room for the boys. You'd sit far around the fire, and then there was a desk area, and then there were sofa areas, and then there was a piano group, and Miss Boyd would ask a couple of violinists in, three of them would play, or, it was all just a cozy family life of cultured people. And we'd go there at Christmas once or twice during the war, and Mr. Boyd would read from Uncle Remus by the fire. And we'd sit around here, and he loved to do that. And that was fun. And then at the end, Catherine was trying to have these musical evenings, these what she'd call carols at Weymouth. She'd send you a little card, carols at Weymouth. But that was towards the end, before she was really ill, but she was already quite lame with it. She'd had arthritis all her life, and they'd gone out to Taos at one time to live for a couple of years, and for her health. The gold treatment was one of the things they were doing at that time. Mrs. Maurice had it, and Catherine tried it, and different ones did it. But I'll tell you, Weymouth is a magnificent thing to do for this community, I think. And I think the house is certainly worth saving. I don't want to see any changes. Personally, I think it's a great pity to play with something of that kind of period. The house had been enlarged and improved through the years. It was not the original house, as you well know. Nobody would expect it to be really. And then his brother's house, Jack Boyd's house was across the road on Connecticut, and it was a large frame house. It had been pulled across the road. Now, some people have suggested that it was the original old house. I don't know. But when the war came, the one boy was killed at Iwo Jima, I think it was. And he was certainly in the Pacific action and killed very suddenly, and it was very hard for the Jack Boyds to take that. And that beautiful collection of arrowheads that's in the Southern Pines Library, it used to be very much in evidence. I don't see it when I go in now. But it was a great circular thing, enormous thing, of all the arrowheads the Mrs. Jackson Boyd had collected with her sons. They used to come here to the Paint Hill Farm because this was a known spot for the paint rock that the Indians used to make their war paint. And the pieces that we dug up, my husband would find on a tractor down the field. He'd turn up little pieces of this rock. We had a large collection of them. Really, I must have had a dozen pieces. And lots of arrowheads. Well, they'd scrape that rock and you'd get this red paint and you could rub it on your face or on your hand. It was obvious that that's what they used. So that was sort of a souvenir of the Boyd family to me. That's evidence that Mrs. Boyd had wandered the woods with her children collecting this. The Campbells came at the end of the war. They came, Mr. Campbell's grandfather had founded General Motors, and he was a man he'd been in the war, and then they came and rented the Burt's house. And that the first winter, because I remember going up and asking them, they were strangers, but I asked them if they'd join the Historical Society and help us. And they wanted to. They were very helpful to everything locally. And they were trying to decide whether they'd live here. And they finally, when Jack's wife died, Jack Boyd's wife died, Harriet, Jack wanted to leave. He lost the son, and the other son was married up in Pennsylvania, so he went to Florida. And the house was for sale, and the Boyds bought it. Then they covered it with brick. The brick came from Charleston, was supposed to have been ballast.
Excuse me, you say the Boyds bought it or the Campbells bought it?
The Campbells bought it,
yes.
I beg your pardon. And they bought it and fixed it beautifully. It was just the most lovely house. They had a decorator from New York who was very famous. And she brought down very interesting rugs. They were mostly Samarkand rugs. And the house was so lovely. Then they decided when their daughter was college age and debutante age to go back to New York. And which they did, and the daughter came out. She's very active in all the good things in New York City. And her mother and father are still living. Her mother isn't too well now. The father was not very well. He'd been on a big game shoot in Africa before he was married and had gotten some curious infection. And in the hospital in New York, his nurse was the woman who became Mrs. Campbell. She was a Canadian, and when they fixed up this lovely Boyd house, they built a small house, which was a guest house in the grounds, where Mrs. Boyd's Canadian parents used to come and spend the winter. And Mr. Boyd fixed up a train house. He was fascinated with railway trains, and his hobby was recreating a little railway train. And he ran the whole length of that big train house. And you'd go out and see what he was doing. And he had a little golf course. And he had one of the big pros come and help him with his golf. They were interesting people. But then they got started in the Boy Scouts. And he went around the state stimulating the Boy Scout movement. And Mrs. Boyd was interested in the Girl Scouts. I mean, Mrs. Campbell. And that's that.
Let's stop for a minute.
Of Paint Hill Farm, where I've lived for so long, actually, I think I came into my log cabin, as we'd come to Southern. We bought this land, actually, in 33. We'd gone up to my mother had rented a house on Highland Road, and Ernest and I were on leave, and we came down to visit her, right from Europe. And then after a few days, we went up to Washington to the FDR inauguration. And we saw the inauguration and came back here. I think inauguration those days was in March. And it was the beauty moment, for the spring was just beginning and unfolding. And we just fell madly in love with everything. And we said, this is the place for us. So as the banks were closed and things were going for mortgages, Mr. Stevens, Gene Stevens, who was an excellent citizen here and built that lovely little building on Broad Street and sort of started a vogue for building the right type of modern building. He said there's a very pretty little farm just outside of the limits of Southern Pines. It's going for a mortgage. And I think you ought to drive out and look at that. So we did. And here was a quince bush, certainly the biggest one I've ever seen in my life, in full bloom. And you could see that the big apple tree was getting ready to bloom too. It was so pretty. And the man who owned it was one of the, well, Reed Page, I think. He was from Aberdeen, and an old colored man had lived in this little red house that we still have on the place for many years as a tenant. And there was this enormous field, there's still a field, behind the house. I've never known quite what they did with that field, but my husband put it to use. Anyway, we paid for it, and we went to see about planting Judas and dogwood around the field. And we went to Mr. Morell, as I remember, and asked him to plant it. And then we went away to Europe. And Ernest didn't retire until the summer of '39. And then we came home, and the war was starting in Europe. And as we drove down here, that fall, because of course we were going back and forth to Illinois by car, and we spent the night in Nashville, Tennessee, and in the lobby they had a radio. And the radio was talking about the invasion in Europe. And that was the first we really knew, because for a day or two we had no newspaper. We'd just been driving along, thinking nothing about it. But in Europe, before we'd come home, we'd used gas masks. They had been given out to the consulate and the embassies and all those places to protect the American citizens, because they knew. And we had known a general in Northern Ireland who was an aide to the governor, and he had told us, General Pollock, he said, it is with you, because he had been in the consular service, which was in those days, we call it the American Foreign Service. We didn't speak anymore about consular service and diplomatic service, because the two branches had been amalgamated in about I think it was 1927, that the Rogers Act was passed. My husband had gone into the Foreign Service 30 years before, and he decided that if after 30 years, and he had a little boy, he wanted him brought up in America. So we agreed on that, and I was terribly pleased, because you could see each country, the child had to learn another language to play with other children. He had to go into a school that perhaps had no English. And we were in Sweden and Denmark and France and so on, so that this was beginning to show. And I was awfully glad when he just made the decision. But that brought us here, because my husband was a Virginian, and the big property he had was a very large farm that we still own. My son has inherited. But that was in back of Norfolk in Princess Anne County, just in back of Virginia Beach. And we didn't want to live out there because it was not a very attractive area. It's very flat and rather ugly. It's very, very good land to own, but it's not very pleasant for living. So that's one reason we bought this little property here. We wanted a place that was congenial to us both. And as he was born a Southerner, he wanted to be in the South and be near Norfolk if he could. So this seemed to be very nice. Well, you know, that general, I look back and think of those last days, and I have lots of pictures of our son trying to play house in the little pond at the large property we were renting in Lisburn, which is a suburb of Belfast. We already knew of the break between the North and the South, the Catholic and the Protestant. That fight has been going on for centuries. And that thing was still evident, because we saw it among our friends. And we went to one of those Orange Day parades, where we were very shocked to see the feeling. And the speakers who got up spoke in a way you couldn't do in this country, really, against the Catholic and the Pope. It was very shocking to see. If you're bred in a country of freedom, of speech, and of worship, it's very hard to get back and see that. So I've had a little sympathy for these people during this terrible problem period we're living through now, when we see the newspapers, see those people shooting each other up. And then we'd go down to visit on the border, and different famous families, great titled families of Northern Ireland. And they would talk in terrible terms about the people who were encroaching, trying to get over the border without going through the cities. They crawl through their streams, so forth, to get from north to south to north. Well, anyway, they'd warned us that there'd be a war, and perhaps Ernest knew it, and he didn't tell me. But it came, and we had all of our things packed. But when we left, when Ernest took his resignation, 1st of July, and everything was in 3 great vans, down on the docks in Belfast. We didn't know that they were going to bomb Belfast. Our American government usually ships home your furniture. If they transfer you, they'll ship your furniture for you. Well, the stuff was all burned because I remember walking these woods just wondering, what will I do? I was simply smitten. I was just knocked over when we got the cable that they'd been bombed and everything we owned was burned. We'd taken a good many family things with us, and it was very hard. The consul who had come to relieve my husband before they had a new consul general went out to identify this bombing on the shipyards of Belfast. And you see the torpedo boats were already out. The Germans were already in the Atlantic. And it wasn't generally known by the public. It was one reason Roosevelt was trying to build up the public opinion so they'd know that the first line of defense was Britain. America was, the America First Committee was busy in the Middle West, the Chicago Tribune and all that. Well, anyway, we got the shock, and we lived through it. But when this house, this cabin, was burned, that was my second loss of treasured things. The photographs of the Alston house when it was being restored. How pretty it was when the Southern Pines Garden Club replaced some of the box. And it all looked so pretty. And all these people like Mrs. Campbell had given us such good things to put in it. I lost all the beautiful linen I had gotten in Ireland and all the fine china that had given me at special prices up in Denmark from the Royal Copenhagen stuff. All these treasures and the rugs we'd gotten in the bazaar in Istanbul. We spent hours, all the diplomats would go to the bazaar every afternoon. We'd all argue about the rugs and whether they came from, Samarkand or where they were. Mr. Crane was one of the world's greatest collectors. He was not only a great toilet millionaire, plumbing millionaire, but he was a connoisseur of the Bokharas. And he gave me a superb Bokhara for a wedding present. And later when we were buying rugs, one of the Bokhara dealers said to me, "Thou come and see the Bokharas." So we looked at all the Bokharas and learned a great deal about rugs. We learned a great deal about silver. There's a great deal of Middle European silver for sale and lots of Russian silver. And jewels from Russia because they were pouring out. The Bolshevik had come in and they were pouring down to all the port cities. And the waitresses in the restaurants might be Russian princesses and all that kind of thing. It was very intriguing. Well, I enjoyed the diplomatic life, but it meant changing every 3 or 4 years. And I was glad to get Tim right here in the Southern Pines Public School. And then we moved out to this farm when Ernest decided he wanted a log cabin. He was the one who chose it. He saw the old woman's exchange before it had been restored so much. And he said, "Now that's the kind of thing. I want to look native." So we went out and looked for a native house. Well, Miss McIntosh was the local dealer, and she was a local woman. She said, "I know of a very handsome log house over near Jackson Springs. I got a Gaelic Bible from that house, and come over there with me." So we went, and we took Mr. Austin, E.J. Austin, marvelous contractor, wonderfully nice man. And we went with him, and he said, "Yes, I can move this house, take it down log by log." They were using it as a tobacco barn. And we came into the living room of that house, that long room, and they had plastered newspapers over the walls because it was leaking. And you see, the plaster they used between these giant logs was just clay, picked up from the road. So it was quite a job. We saw them take it down, we saw them move it, we saw them put it up. And they'd have to roll up these great logs along, great things. They've always great fun to see it. And then we loved living in it, but the first winter we were cold. We weren't very smart about that. We thought the fireplace would do it. And then the electrician was an awfully nice man. He said, "You better put some extra wiring in here so you'll have super strength for your heating, because you may need it." We said, "Oh, I don't think so, Oh, well, he was right. We had these extra things. We had long stoves, long sort of little heaters. Well, we were very cold indeed. So we rented a house in town. for 2 months. And we went in, I guess it was January and February or something. We did that 2 winters before we got ourselves really established with a furnace. We dug a hole, one of these very good architects, Mr. Reinecke, and we put it down and put a little wing, which would be a servant's toilet and a closet for the china and so forth, a little pantry business, and then a drop so you could go down to a basement where the furnace. And that was a very wise thing. Our winters became very pleasant. Then, little by little, we realized that we couldn't live under the eaves forever. I remember one night, Livingston Biddle came out to dinner, and he said, "But I don't understand where your closet space is. What do you do with your shoes?" Well, that was it. Suddenly we had a son, who was getting older, wanted more space. So we built on this wing. And it was done very well by Al Yeomans. Al Yeomans was an architect and a landscape architect. He did the Boyd's property. He was a cousin of Mr. Boyd's. Came from Chicago, and he did some beautiful things around town. So we lived in that house until the lightning struck it and burned it in a stormy night in June of 1986. No, 85. June of 85, that's right. And then I suffered for 1 year thinking I'll never go back, and my son had said all the time, "Of course you'll go back. I was raised there, Mother. I have to go back." And he just took it in hand that I would have another house on the same spot. And I'm so glad he did. Because I love this hillside, and I like to look out and think I planted some of this stuff, that I carried buckets of water when I didn't have a hose. And we had a horse, and Adley would come down. Adley liked to ride, and he was in Washington during the war, of course, and afterwards for a little while. He found a certain type of peace coming here that he couldn't have, because any public life, is hard. And he would take this horse I bought from the Strattons. They owned the Malloway stable. And he would go off into the woods, and he would come back hours later, and the reins were over the horse's neck, and he was just sitting on there, because the horse had had a good long run, because we didn't give it very much exercise. And he'd wandered through the woods, and they'd come up that hill, and I could see the sweat on the neck of that horse and know they'd had a good time. And Adley would stretch out. We had a big sofa that had been in our house in Bloomington, enormous great sofa, where we used to sit as children and do our schoolwork. And he was stretched right straight out flat on that sofa and go to sleep. And he used to say when he'd walk into that little cabin, "Oh, you spent quite a little money trying to go native, but I like it." And he was just the one place. Then he'd lie on the lawn sometimes just stretch himself right out on the ground and go sound asleep. He enjoyed it. He didn't come here for society. He came here to rest and to have the peace and quiet of a home. And then, there were interesting people living far away over in what we call Derby, the other side of Pinehurst. They were the Loverings and the Tuckermans, and of course the Maurices out near Eagle Springs. They came from sophisticated, aristocratic, wealthy families. They came down here for just that, to be in the country. They all tried to have peaches. They all gave up peaches eventually. And Georgia took over the peaches, but they stayed on the land, and they had lovely houses, lovely grounds. The wives worked on the grounds, the husbands worked on the grounds, everybody was busy. And when they'd entertain, it was really a delight, because we'd go I remember once we drove Adley out there in the spring, and he said, "My, you're going a long way for dinner." Well, I think we must have been at least 10 miles out of Pinehurst, maybe 15. Because when you went to the Maurices, we were the other side of the West End. And their beautiful house still stands. Of course, they're all dead, all those wonderful people. If you can find a book called Sand in My Shoe, it'll tell you a little about that, Sand in My Shoes. But that was written by a woman who lived here in that era, and it was very successful because she told all about these people and the way they were living. To go away to boarding school. Eventually. The life in Pate Hill Farm was really so country. That was the delicious thing. During the war, I had a horse and a little buggy. And you know, we would drive into town with the eggs. And then when we cut our asparagus, we'd take the asparagus in. And we'd go to Mr. Blue. He had a small grocery store on the east side of Broad Street. And our horse used to shy at the train. So we had to be very careful. We knew what time of day the big trains were going through. Because Ernest went in one day and had a runaway. And it was really probably scary. But the wife of the man who was the dewberry farmer, see, Ernest was growing dewberries. That was very much the thing at the moment. And this whole area where peaches had failed because of the cold, they were planting dewberries. Now, that was one of the prettiest crops you can imagine. They put the posts all through the field. Then they had a wire. And the dewberry plant would come up and drape over the posts and along the wire. So you were seeing this lovely white thing when it was in bloom in the spring. It was too pretty. Then under that little shed we had, Ernest would do the packing, and a truck would bring out over the pickers. And they were colored people, mostly from the Berkeley area, and they would come, and one man spoke to me the other day on the street and said, I used to pick dewberries with my family at your husband's place. Well, that was one of those wonderful spring days before I'd go out to Illinois and I'd see the dewberry crop. And Ernest was a big landlord. You see, he was having a lot of fun with this. Then he would take his dewberries and drive up to Cameron, where they had they would be shipped from there to New York. And once when we came into New York, I'll never forget, we saw in the Plaza Hotel on the menu, dewberries. And we realized maybe they came from ours. But it was great fun. Then, of course, Tim was trained. I remember one of my wealthy friends who came to visit me, and she said, that boy will never go wrong who's been brought up on this place. He knows what it is to take part and be responsible. That little boy was sent out to the gin building, which my husband had brought over from Mount Gilead area because of those enormous logs. He was impressed. And it also had that cotton gin wheel, which he was amazed to see. So in there we had a stall for a horse, and we had the tack in the second room, and we had that arranged. Well, Tim had to go out at night to water that horse and be sure it had been fed. And then in the morning he had to go before he went to school. Then we had our dogs. We had guineas, and Mrs. Cannon started my guinea flock. She had her from her farm near Concord, North Carolina. She had an enormous guinea collection and peacocks. And she sent me down to peacock, hen, and rooster. And we had those down here. And then Mrs. Page brought over a mirror. And I said, what's that for? She said, well, to put in the peacock bed. I said, why? She said, didn't you know that peacocks like to strut? So, of course, sure enough, we go down there, that old peacock was strutting away in front of the mirror. Well, we didn't want them to fly around because they made such awful noises and frightened you so terribly. Finally, Betty DeMaine in Pinehurst wanted the peacocks, so we gave them to her. She had about 20 peacocks in a pen in her backyard. Well, I don't, there's so many funny things. Ernest, having been sitting as a diplomat in diplomatic posts all around Europe, here he was out in his I remember he had blue shirts, and he'd come up stained with perspiration under his arms when he'd come up to lunch, and his blue jean pants, and he'd sit at the table, and he'd look simply, like the real farmer, but my golly, he always had his hair brushed, and he always had sort of pulled his collar together. It was very funny in those days. They were so particular about their collars. And now they keep more open. They'll show their underwear and their hair, anything. But those days, not at all. That was all buttoned up. And then he sort of apologized for his appearance. And it was very amusing. And then in the afternoon, he'd see that he was bathed and changed. And he'd sit out on this porch like the old captain of his ship and say, now, I want my sundowner. Then he'd have his first drink of the day. But he enjoyed getting into the soil. And I think I said to Mrs. Hunt, Struthersbird's sister who lived here, why does Ernest want to go to that farm in Norfolk, and why does he want to live on this farm in Southern Pines? She said he's a throwback to his Virginia ancestors. They're all farmers. All those men, those planters, were farmers. And they finally got such big land that they had to have slaves do it. But he said, actually, Ernest is having the time of his life. He's happier probably than he's ever been because he's on a tractor on his own field. And he can do as he pleases. Oh, he did the funniest things. He would take me out to plant watermelons. He'd say, now this row, if we put 3 seeds in each hole, and we have so many holes, we will have so many watermelon. And, you know, he had all on paper. Well, we didn't get that number, as I may say. And if we had, they were being sold on every street corner anyway, so what? And then he had the blueberries. Then he had raspberries. Then we always had strawberries, and of course, an enormous amount of asparagus. And we had the chickens, and they were all down at the farm. And at one time, we had a cow we bought from Mrs. Proctor because of the milk. And that cow was being, you know, milked. But one day, the farmer went away, the tenant went away for a few days, and the cow was not milked. And the little maid we had was a wonderful woman. She lived in the country. She said, Mrs. Ives, I think you ought to go down and look at that cow. The udder is very swollen. And I said, oh dear, I don't know anything about a cow. I better call the vet. So that very nice man came over. And he went down to examine it and said, the cow has not been milked for so long. You will have to take some Vaseline that I will leave with you and go down and massage the tits of the udder. They are all hard and breaking. I said, I cannot do it. I cannot face it. So I gave this little chart to this wonderful cook who knew all about cows and how to handle them. Well, all kinds of funny things happen to you when you live in the country. It's just delightful. Of course, we were marooned. We were marooned twice in snowstorms. We just couldn't get out. And Ernest had to get the tractor and try to open the roads. And several trees had fallen over the roads. And those had to be taken out almost professionally, you know. He couldn't handle the trees. So we finally got the man who used to run the boys' farms to come out and clear the road. You know, and then it was so cold and everything frozen, and the wires were all down, so the electricity wasn't coming to us. We were losing candles and the fireplace in my bedroom. And then for the next season, we decided we better have a little kerosene stove with this of trouble. And it's still sitting in the gin unused. But we tried to prepare ourselves. You see, the icebox wasn't working. Nothing was working. And we were opening cans and warming up the food over the fireplace. It wasn't very good. I remember Mrs. Burt saying to me that first winter before we'd gone in town, she said, Elizabeth, what are you doing sleeping up in that garret in that house of yours? Aren't you awfully cold? And I said, well, my head's cold at night. Oh, she said, you must wear a nightcap. And she said, you must go to bed with your sweater on. You must never let yourself be cold. So I didn't know quite how to get a nightcap, but I did have a big scarf, which I tied over my head. It was all rather funny. We had a happy time. We really did. Get a nightcap, but I did have a big scarf, which I tied over my head. It was all rather funny. We had a happy time. We really did.